Hello and welcome to today's lecture in the Pandemic 101 series on racial group politics and COVID-19. I'm Jenna Spinelli, Communication Specialist for the McCourtney Institute for Democracy here in the College of the Liberal Arts. Before I introduce today's guest, I just wanted to set a few ground rules for today's presentation and let you know about some other events that are coming up for the class of 2024. We will leave time for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the lecture. I will be collecting them and reading them at the end. If you have questions about your next steps as an accepted student in the College of the Liberal Arts, you can reach out to our recruitment coordinator, Chantel Harley, at 814-865-7141, or cuharley@psu.edu. Again, 814-865-7141 or cuharley@psu.edu. That information is also accessible from the Prospective Students page on the College of the Liberal Arts website. And don't forget about the university's webinars for the class of 2024 that are happening over the next few weeks. You can find more information on those, including one with Penn State President Eric Barron at classof2024.psu.edu. Now I am delighted to introduce Ray Block, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, who is going to talk to us today about how race shapes our experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. That includes things like economic anxiety and perceptions of how the government is responding to the virus outbreak. And Ray will be drawing from public opinion surveys to illustrate his findings. So I'm excited to hear about all of this interesting work. So without further ado, please take it away, Ray.
It would be impossible to do a conversation like this without talking a little bit about economic anxieties as they relate to what is clearly a health-based crisis in the country and across the world. And finally, I wouldn't be doing my job as a political scientist if I didn't talk a little bit about policy related information. And so I have one slide that talks a little bit about COVID related policy attitudes. And the punchline I'll give away already is that there's more agreement than there is disagreement across groups when it comes to that stuff. And so this is what I had outlined for us. Let's go ahead and start talking a little bit about it now. So about some of the polls that I'm talking about. So I've collected some data myself, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. That survey is the one called Supplemental Survey number 3. I guess I'm starting at the bottom and working my way up. And that's a recent poll that me and some collaborators have done in my capacity as a senior analyst for an organization called the African American Research Collaborative. Now that's a poll on African American respondents only. So I'll be using some of that information when I can, when there are other survey questions that have similar topics that are discussed, that have samples that are more diverse than the one that I did. So another sample that I'm going to be making use of is an ABC News Ipsos poll, which was fielded early April. Also a CNN poll that was fielded in late March. And most of the information I'm going to be covering today is going to be coming from a poll that was done mid-March by Pew. And the reason why that poll is important is because it's a very large sample size and a very nice representation of African American and white respondents inside of it. And so I'll have headers and footers that kind of say what polls are being referenced when, but you should know that a combination of these surveys are going to be the basis for this presentation I'm going to be giving you today.
Hey, Ray, if I could just jump in for 1 second. I know I said I would hold questions till the end, but there's one that came in that I think is relevant to set the stage here. Someone's asking, does the survey group that's when you refer to white, does it exclude people who identify as Hispanic, or how are Hispanic folks accounted for in these surveys you're referencing?
Yeah, so in all of these surveys, there is an option to designate whether you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic white, or Hispanic or Black Hispanic or non-Hispanic Black. I'm referring currently to those people who specifically say African American or Black without a Hispanic designation.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that I don't care about these groups. It's just that this is the focus of what I'll be talking about today. So let's start out thinking about the relevance of COVID-19. In other words, how important or how front of the mind are these issues related to it for people? And there are several questions I think are really interesting in terms of looking at this stuff. And you see a lot of agreement if you look on the left-hand side of the screen here. And I broke the slide up into two pieces, and I have what I'm going to call an interest in COVID-19 news question that's asking people how closely they've been following along about this stuff. And most people are saying that they're following this pretty closely, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone. I also have a question here about how much your life has been turned upside down since the coronavirus has happened. And in this case, you notice that most people are saying that their lives have changed significantly. I have that broken down by racial group because I have survey data that allows me to do that. And you also see that over time, and of course, this is only a little small snapshot in time done at the time periods that the polls were fielded, but I see an increase in the number of African Americans who say that their lives have been affected drastically by the coronavirus relative to the number of white respondents who say that their lives have been drastically affected by the coronavirus. And so there's an uptick in both racial groups, but the uptick across these two polls is bigger for African Americans than it is for the white respondents. And there are lots of things we can think about for why that might be the case. I am actually here to tell a story about the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on communities of color in general. And that story is going to be one that's consistent with a lot of the polling information I'm going to be sharing with you today. And that is a story of things being bad for everyone and things being bad in unique and particularly troubling ways for people of African American descent. And some of these pieces of information, I invite people to see the degree to which they generalize to other populations of color and to other disadvantaged communities and to other non-dominant demographic groups. Now, looking at the perceived impact of COVID-19, there were a couple of surveys that we were actually able to get our hands on that actually asked questions about this and pretty direct questions. And so one of those question sets asked for people to identify whether or not they know people who have been stricken by the virus. Now, that question series not only asked whether or not people know someone who's got it or who recovered from it, but sometimes those question sets ask people whether or not they know someone who's passed away from it. And what I'm showing you here are results from two polls. One is the poll of African Americans, and that's the one you see on the left. And another one's from the ABC News Ipsos poll that was done in early April on the right. And it's comparing people's responses to those questions. In other words, can a person say that they know someone they care about or that's a member of their family that has either gotten COVID-19 or has passed away from COVID-19? Now, regardless of what pie chart you're looking at, these are really upsetting numbers. Because if we're looking at this stuff and comparing across groups, close to 40% of the African American respondents are saying yes to that question. And a fifth, more than a fifth, of the white respondents in these surveys are saying yes to that question. And so it's really hard to deny the perceived significance of the virus because it's also really hard to deny the actual impact of COVID-19 in a very real way in terms of the spread and exposure to the virus. Now, this is something that comes uniquely from the African American Research Collaborative poll that I fielded about a week or so ago. And we included an open-ended question on that survey. And we essentially wanted people to tell us what came to mind in one or two words when we said coronavirus / COVID-19. And then we took those responses and we put them together in a word cloud so that we could check out what people were thinking about. So this is like our way of summarizing these sentiments, in this case, among African American respondents, in terms of how they felt about COVID-19, in terms of what they expressed when they had an opportunity to type some stuff out in the online portion of the survey that we did. And I just feel like the words here speak for themselves. And these words shouldn't be surprising to most people who've been following either the news about this stuff or have been dealing with this stuff in their own lives. And so a lot of these words connote danger and fear and death and scariness and the kind of things that you would expect people to say if you give them an opportunity, for example, to talk a little bit in the survey and give their own words for describing what some of this stuff is about. Moving from the perceived relevance of COVID-19 to opinions people have about the response to COVID-19. I have a few slides here. The first one looks at what I'm going to call the across levels of government set of attitudes that people might have. And so this series of questions, by the way, is asking people to essentially rate the quality of the job that various people at various levels of government are doing when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. And so I want people to think about this in terms of the dark blue section of the stacked bar graphs that you see in front of you. And that means I want people to be paying attention to the number of people who say poor when it comes to how they rate the response of entities of government when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. And several things should show up. One of the things that should show up is that outside of Donald Trump, there's a lot of similarity in terms of how people perceive these levels of government as doing. So governors are rated in ways that look pretty similar across the racial groups. Local officials are being rated in ways that to a degree look similar across the racial groups. And I feel like the largest racial difference shows up when you get over to the part of the graph that looks at Donald Trump's ratings. And in this case, Donald Trump is overall, if you're checking out the poor ratings, getting higher numbers of people selecting that than any other entities that were queried in these surveys in terms of the job that they're doing. And I feel like this is a result that I feel needs to be looked at a little more. So I took this result and started subdividing the information in it so we can get a clearer picture about how this stuff looks for real. So this is Trump. And this is across a handful of surveys. Again, this is me scrambling to put these things together as they come out. But what I want to show you here is that there's a clear trend. And the trend is that the percentage of people that believe that Trump is doing a poor job of managing the pandemic differs in meaningful and noticeable ways by race. And that's something that you can clearly see looking at the trends. But even if you take time out of the equation here, you can see that generally African Americans are using that rating to rate the president. And honestly, whites are using that rating with a high level of frequency too. So if we go all the way to the end of the time periods that are looked at here, roughly close to half of the respondents that are white in the survey are saying that they believe the president's not doing a particularly awesome job managing the pandemic. And the results are upwards of 85% by the time you get to the end of the trend chart if you're looking at this for African Americans. African Americans started out being less generous in their responses to Trump's response to the COVID-19, and those responses have become less complimentary over time, at least with the snapshot that I'm showing you here. Still looking at this some more because I feel like these job ratings questions are really important. And so I wanted to spend a little more time looking at job ratings questions. And what I did this time is I subdivided the results for governors across geographic region. And it's harder to see here, but what interested me is that if you're looking at positive ratings, and in this case, these are people who are giving excellent and good ratings for their governors. And looking at this across geographic regions, what we notice is that positive ratings are at their highest among African Americans in the Midwest, followed closely by the Northeast. And among African Americans, positive ratings are at their lowest if we're looking at respondents who live in the South. And I have some ideas about why this might be the case. And one of the ideas that might show up, and I think later data will show this to be more true, is that Southern places typically have leaders in them at the state level who have been moving in a manner that prioritizes rebuilding the economy, sometimes perceivably at the expense of caring for and securing the flattening of the curve before the boosting of the economy takes place. And so in places, for example, where governors are more inclined to move quicker towards reopening and to move in ways that are more aggressive when it comes to revitalizing the economy, at least in this graph that I'm showing you here, places like that tend to get African Americans that are less positive in their ratings of leaders. And so there's probably a story to tell here that's more nuanced than what you can see in a graph. But I think this is pretty interesting. It's the reason why I wanted to spend some time looking at job ratings. So let's go ahead and move on from that and talk about trusted information sources. And so in the survey that I did with the African American Research Collaborative, we asked people to rate on a 10-point scale how much they trusted certain things and entities and sources to give accurate information to them about COVID-19. And we were lucky enough to find another poll. In this case, it was a CNN poll that asked a similar set of questions. Of course, they didn't have a lot of types of sources in common, but the two sources they had in common were cable news and local officials. And by and large, the respondents in both of those surveys tend to trust local officials for information about COVID-19 over new cable news sources. And white respondents in particular seem less, I guess, trusting of cable news sources relative to African American respondents, but local officials seem to be trusted at similar levels if you're looking across the two racial groups. Again, something I think is interesting that someone could do some more research on. But at this point, I'm just trying to give you an idea of how I would run a class if I were using survey data to paint a picture about what polls can tell us about the experiences across groups when it comes to COVID-19. Now, economic anxieties, there are a couple of items here, so I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about those. One of those items asks whether or not people who responded to questions in the survey can say that someone in their household has had one of these things happen to them. And I'm sorting this stuff across racial groups. And the two questions that I were able to show here are ones that look at whether or not people have been laid off of work or lost their jobs, or whether people actually kept their jobs but had to take a significant pay cut from their jobs. And it's really easy to see that a lot of people are saying that this hasn't happened to them, which is comforting in some regard. But the fact that, for example, the percentage of African American and white respondents who say they've had to take a pay cut is upwards of 25%. In other words, more than a quarter for both of those racial groups is upsetting and really troubling. Also, the fact that a little bit over 20% of the African Americans say that they know, whether they say that someone in their household has experienced a layoff or a job loss, and close to 20% of the white respondents in the survey are saying the same thing, is also troubling. And that speaks more broadly to the economic anxiety that this pandemic is bringing on. Also, if we rate the, I guess, perceived economic impact that people believe that the coronavirus is going to have in the United States, these are some items that I think are also especially interesting, where if the options are it will cause a slowdown but not a recession, arguably a relatively optimistic economic outcome, I guess, in the context of what we're dealing with, to people who say that it will cause a recession, to people who say it will cause a depression. What we notice is that you see these interesting racial differences in terms of how optimistic or not optimistic people are. And it seems, even though the number differences aren't very large, that white respondents are more likely, or at least in this case, more inclined to see the less optimistic outcome showing up than they are to see the more optimistic outcome showing up. Now, in terms of policy attitudes, we were lucky in the sense that there were lots of policy questions across at least one of the surveys. And I wanted to look at these, and I sorted these by race. And I think if you were just to step back and look at the findings, a lot of this wouldn't be too surprising. And keep in mind too, when this poll was done, in this case, it was the Pew survey that was done in mid-March. At the time, a lot of these things were actually still being worked out. I feel like we're now in a place where a lot of this just sounds like it's common sense in a COVID world, right? But the idea that I want you to see is that across a lot of different policy domains, for example, restricting international travel, requiring non-essential businesses to close down, asking people not to gather in large groups, which at some point became really hard to do once the stay-at-home orders started being put in place across states across the country, canceling major sports and entertainment events. And I feel like this is an interesting moment because we are now starting to bring very slowly and very deliberately some sporting events back into the fold, right? K through 12 school closings, limiting restaurant activity to carry out and delivery only, and postponing of coming state primary elections when applicable to the respondents, what we notice is that most people, regardless of what racial group they're in, say that these things are necessary for now. In other words, there's not a lot of disagreement across the racial groups when it comes to the need to implement policies that keep us safe, at least in the time period now, right? In fact, if you see any differences, usually it's differences with respect to the types of policies that are being asked about. So businesses, for example, the closing of non-essential businesses is one that doesn't get as large a unanimous agreement as you get, for example, with restricting international travel, because people who own small businesses are suffering right now in very meaningful ways and would like access to their customers again. But we have to figure out how to do that in the safest possible way, obviously. Likewise, postponing primary elections is not a policy attitude that people are well, it's not a policy domain that people are expressing overwhelming support for. Even though at the time the survey was done, this was a major policy question because it was something that people were going to have to literally deal with if their primary season put them in position to have to go out, for example, to vote in the spring, or as we move into the summer, right? Now, these are all of the slides that I had, but I wanted to go back to the general idea that I started with when I began this presentation, is that I see what I'm giving you here as a sample of what a class would look like if you were taking a race and public opinion course. And in a course like that, normally I organize them around certain themes. The themes can be about policy because policy is really interesting to talk about. It could be about race relations more abstractly. In this case, I organized some survey data to tell us things about what people's attitudes are about COVID-19 and how an understanding of race relations in the United States can influence what we understand about the way people feel about what's going on with COVID-19. Thank you very much. My time says we're at 30 minutes at the hour. I wanted to make sure that there was a lot of time for Q&A. And so I'm open to that stuff now.
Great. Well, thank you, Ray. That was a very engaging and interesting presentation. Lots of data to dive into there. It'll probably take a minute or two for some questions to come in. So, you know, I had a couple that came to mind as you were going through the slides there. Can you, so, you know, you just talked at the end there about how you would frame this data in terms of teaching it to a class, but you know, I think we see these polls a lot. We hear them reported on the news or see them come up cited on social media, what have you. Can you just talk a little bit more broadly about what the goal of this polling is, like from a non-academic perspective, like who are people who conduct these polls trying to reach, or what is the goal of public opinion polling in general?
Wow, that's a big one. So.
Yeah.
There are two approaches to thinking about this stuff, and I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on people's motivations for polling, right? But I know that I've been doing a lot of this work myself, and you asked for the non-academic aspects of it. So if I quickly go into the academic aspect of it, we need to gauge, to the degree we can, what's on the minds of people. And we've been using polling data for decades to do just that. And in political context, polling has become extremely important, not only to us gauging people's opinions about political causes and topics, but also in informing candidates and people in office about what the people care about and are interested in. And so in my academic world, I'm often thinking about polling data as the thing we can use to help build a bridge between the wants and desires and preferences of the masses and the activities of elites, right? It's not the only way that you could do public opinion. You can write letters to candidates, and you can write letters to people in office to communicate your desires and your interests and your preferences. But polling has a very efficient and historically grounded way of helping out with that stuff too. So outside of the academic circles, I think that my answer is pretty similar. Insofar as a lot of the work that I do that extends beyond the academy is me sharing and querying about what communities of color care about and what their interests are and what their preferences are, then again, my work as a pollster allows me to help to build a bridge between what people want and what leaders are getting information about. And hopefully there's a representation element to this stuff. Because if preferences are communicated and desires and wants via polling results are communicated to leaders, then leaders are in a position to adhere to or listen to or not what those preferences are and what those interests are and what those desires are. And so I feel like I'm actually pretty consistent now in terms of how I think about it. I do a lot of this stuff academically because I want to study the connection between what polling data gives us about mass level preferences and what leaders respond to when given the opportunity to get access to that information. And in my non-academic hat, when I wear a non-academic hat, it seems like I'm looking at similar things. I'm looking in particular at communities of color, and I'm looking in particular at the bridge between what information gets to leaders via polling and what the information that's gotten to leaders results in terms of leadership and how that represents communities of color.
Yeah, no, that's so important, I think, for groups that, traditionally are not as represented in media or in culture or in politics or positions of power. Having that bridge or those mechanisms to get data to leaders is so important. And that actually ties nicely into a question we received in the chat. Someone asking, what's next on your research agenda? What do you hope to explore next in this line of work that you've been doing, or perhaps what's missing from the polls that have been done so far?
I've been really interested in political messages. In other words, so like I'm really interested in what polling research can tell us about the usefulness of certain political messages and about the not usefulness of other types of political messages. And so here's an example, and I don't have polling data on this for African Americans and white respondents, but I can give you some anecdotes if you're willing to listen to them. And so one of the arguments that I've been having with a bunch of people, and I'm sorry for everybody I've had this argument about with, is that the narrative about flattening the curve versus boosting the economy, I don't think is fair, because I feel like they're not mutually exclusive outcomes. And I don't think you can do one very successfully without engaging the other one successfully too. One of the questions in the poll that I recently did on African American respondents was an attempt for us to see how those messages were hitting home with Black respondents. And it was really fascinating to see, for example, because the African American respondents in that survey, which was done a week or so ago, really gave you a picture of how economically disadvantaged people are in general, and how the pandemic is, I guess, amplifying economic inequality in our country. And the respondents that were talking to us in that survey were really feeling it, and they were communicating that to us. That said, the respondents in the survey I recently fielded were quite hesitant to work in a manner that aggressively pursued boosting the economy. In other words, if there was going to be this quote unquote choice between flattening the curve and making sure folks are safe first and taking longer before we start getting back out into our jobs and back out into society, the African American respondents who were hit really hard economically by the pandemic were actually responding in ways that suggested they were very hesitant to move too hastily when it comes to getting the economy back on track, right? And so I would think a message like that would be a really important message to have, because it's different from the either or characterization you often hear in the news, where people will say things like, we need to get the economy boosted up and we need to do that now. And sometimes the thing that isn't said is, regardless of what some of the fallout will be in terms of health and humanity when it comes to it. And so messages like this and the ability to poll to see what responses to messages like that are might give us an opportunity to say, for example, that we can use different messages and those messages are appealing to people. And politicians can use those messages in ways that can draw more people in when it comes to thinking about this stuff. And there might not be a cost in the sense that you're polarizing voters while doing so. For example, if we're thinking about flattening the curve versus boosting the economy, I would imagine there's more opportunity for common ground across voters, regardless of what party they are, and regardless of what part of the country they're in, and regardless of their demographic background. And if politicians are more inclined to use messages that are inclusive, that somehow create not a binary choice between these two things, these two outcomes, then maybe we can get different political choices being made by leaders on the back end.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and yeah, that comes back to what we were talking about before about making that connection between the public and the people who the public elects to represent them in office. I'm going to unmute here Jeff Hyde, who is a liberal arts alum. I believe Jeff has a question.
Hello, Jeff.
Yes. Oops. I'm muted. Yes, I appear to be unmuted now.
Hey, Jeff.
My question, Ray, is a simple one, but I want to make sure I get the premise based on what you told us earlier, so it makes a little more sense. I'm going back to your previous answer where Jenna asked you the purpose of the data, how do we use it? And paraphrasing you badly, you stated it would be a way to demonstrate opinion of people and the highly rated by the data that you pulled together, then that would be presented to policymakers for them to see the opinion of the people and react accordingly. Now, my question becomes, do you think the policymakers have addressed the data issues in your different stratas that you presented here today? And I'm thinking along the lines of the feds, but then also down to the states, since a lot of this has run through the governors. And I just throwing out some states that I think have hit the news the most are New York, California, Michigan versus Georgia, Florida, Texas, and then even Wisconsin, which has taken their fight a little bit differently from the policymakers to a purportedly judicial answer. I'll stop there. That was a whole lot of words, so I'll let you answer them.
So I want to take this back to the idea that we're in a campaign right now. So we're in a campaign season, although it feels weird because there's so much going on that's not political, that sometimes I think we forget that people in office are trying to figure out ways to stay there. And people who don't have political position are trying to find ways to get them, right? And so I'm not necessarily focused solely on the presidential election. A lot of people are, but I think down ballot too, right? There are representatives at the state and local level who get a lot of love, basically, from respondents in this survey. And these are people that could, for example, craft messages that don't create this idea that we have to flatten the curve first or fix the economy first, right? These are people who could benefit from messages that merge those ideas together in a more comprehensive plan for dealing with how literally the neighborhoods in your constituency are going to reopen and how the businesses in your backyard are going to be taken care of, right? So we are pitching the results of this survey, for example, to communities that typically have conversations with policymakers. With the poll that I did on Black respondents only, that's a poll that got support from a couple of medical professionals at Yale University, and one of our sponsors was the NAACP, right? And these are folks that are in a position to actually do public-facing work that can be informed by the survey data that we bring to bear on this stuff. And ultimately, these things can possibly, for example, get in the hands of mayors or get into the hands of city council people who are literally trying to figure out what to do in their constituencies to get things back rolling again. And I'm not saying that the stuff higher up on the ballot is completely off the books, but a lot of times when I think about this kind of data, I'm thinking about my leaders in my community and what I can help them out with and what I can tell them that might be useful for them. Does that help you, Jeff?
I think
I don't see him anymore.
Yeah, I think I put him back on mute. Maybe okay. he can follow up in the Q&A or raise his hand again if there's a follow up. But in the meantime, another question here. What do you make of the differences in outlook on the severity of the economic crisis? So the graphs you were showing about, it seems like African Americans are not as pessimistic as white Americans, at least in those polls that you showed there. So what do you make of those differences and how we should be thinking about them?
I want to go to the slides so I can jog my own memory. It's over here. Yeah. So I really wish that we had a fine-grained way of figuring out who the essential versus non-essential employees are in the surveys that we were working on. And we didn't have a really fine-grained way of doing it. So what we ended up doing is we asked some questions to people. And so for the survey on African Americans, we asked whether or not they had to go to work, right? Not the most elegant way of getting at it, but we were trying to see whether or not these folks had jobs that required them to go outside. And less than a fifth of the respondents said yes to that question. But then we asked another question, and we asked whether or not they had jobs that were currently indoors, but that would soon be outdoors. I mean, well, outside of the home types of jobs. So maybe not necessarily deemed initially as essential jobs, but would soon be considered essential jobs in the sense that they have to leave out the home and go back to work in some capacity. And we saw a similar number of African Americans who said yes to that too. And so if we were able in a really good way to figure out who the essential workers are and who the non-essential workers are, maybe the optimism is based on who's essential and who's non-essential, because the non-essential folks who don't have it like us professors do, where we can work from home and our salaries aren't extraordinarily highly affected by it, at least here at Penn State. If, for example, those folks are thinking about this, those folks are probably more pessimistic about what's going on because it's literally hitting them in a way that's different than it would be hitting other people. But even that conversation, I think, has terrible racial undertones to it, because the people who are in positions to have to be outside right now working and who are currently and possibly in the future classified as essential workers, those folks tend also to be racial and ethnic minorities. And those folks tend not to have as much power over their circumstances of work as the people who don't have to currently be classified as essential workers, and the small business owners who, for example, right now are really suffering because they can't do the things that maintain their livelihood. But once their livelihood is back maintained, they have a lot of autonomy over how their livelihood works.
Right. No, that's really interesting, thinking about that essential, non-essential breakdown there, and it seems like maybe that's an opportunity for more work to be done in this area too. While you have your slides up here, Ray, there was a question about the word cloud that you showed, about the most commonly used phrases or responses to thinking about COVID-19. Just a question, do you have a similar image that shows the concerns of white Americans and how that might compare to what African Americans said here?
Unfortunately, no. And this is actually one of those times where I kind of want to punt because this is the kind of thing, for example, that a Mood of the Nations poll, if I can kind of like prop up the McCourtney Institute and the really, really good people that do work there, would actually have, or at least would use as a way of getting people to gauge their sentiments. I don't have that here, right? I would be shocked if the word cloud looked way different than the kind of word clouds you see here. If anything, you might notice that across racial groups, folks are pretty worried and scared, and they think the pandemic is dangerous and deadly and whatever, what have you. And if anything, it might just be a matter of what I'm going to call the volume of these kind of words being mentioned in these word clouds as opposed to the type of words that are being mentioned, if that makes sense. In other words, I would expect a similarly negative looking word cloud. Maybe the degree to which the word cloud looks negative is probably more so or less so depending on what racial group you're paying attention to or what demographic group you're paying attention to. But I generally expect negativity in terms of the responses.
Right. Yeah, and that's, thank you first of all for plugging the Mood of the Nation poll, and yeah, I think that would be an interesting one to dive into further as well. One other question that I had in terms of disparities, when you were talking about the sources of information, that slide, you mentioned that there were only two sources in common, the local government and cable news. I'm wondering if you can speak to what some of the differences were, like what sources that one group identified but not the other, and why there were only two in common.
Yeah, so I think I was really wedded to showing Black versus white differences or commonalities in the slides that I have here. But for the survey that I did recently, we had a bunch of information sources in it. And I'm gonna cut them into groups. Some of the information sources were indigenous in the sense that these were like African American trusted sources, and some of them weren't, right? So we asked, for example, whether or not people were keeping track of what Jerome Adams was saying about COVID-19, Surgeon General. We asked about whether or not folks were trusting their clergy members or the leaders of churches to give them useful and accurate information about the virus, whether or not doctors and nurses were the people they trusted mostly to get information from. And they have a very general cable news category that they use and that we use too. But we also cut it across CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News to see whether or not we would get different trust levels, at least in that sample, based on those sources. And generally, the African Americans in that survey just tended not to trust news sources for information about COVID-19. And so I would love to say that I got this really strong finding that Fox News was more or less good, or that MSNBC was more or less good, but the numbers are pretty clustered closely. And what it suggested, though, is that people are more likely to trust local healthcare providers and members of churches and leaders in churches, and at least in our survey of African Americans, African American indigenous sources of information than they were some of these cable news and digital sources.
Yeah,
and I
that
think
is,
that shows up here. I'm sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. No, I was going to say that is really interesting. Going back to that idea of a representation, right? If people are more likely to trust sources that they feel like they have some connection to, or that they see themselves in, or something like that.
Yeah.
We're going to go here to John Gastel, Professor of Communication Arts and Sciences and Political Science, who has a question. John.
Hey there, Ray. Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
So here's my question. So you see similarities right now, and I was really struck by them. I'm excited that I got to see the slides because I was expecting bigger differences, if just because of partisanship being baked in. Obviously, we're in a big election year, and your concern about messaging is spot on because we're going to get some pretty strong messaging since this is the election issue. How do you see these kind of findings changing? If we did cross-sectional surveys leading up to November, you see this changing as a result of the political dynamics of the presidential election coming up? It's just kind of a wide open question on this is where we are right now, but how do you think the COVID messaging is going to play out? And will we still see this similarity, or do you think we're going to see some strong movement on one or the other groups on these kinds of questions as a result of those campaign messages?
All right, so I'm gonna tell you about two things I feel pretty comfortable talking about. One of them's gubernatorial, and the other one's about the presidency. I'll give you the presidency one first because that's what you started with, right? So in the survey data that I'm looking at for Black folks, and I've been looking for a while now, there are several polls that I'm involved with directly or indirectly, and they're all coming out at different points in time. So I'm not saying that we chose to do it this way, but you can think of it as different cross-sections, giving us patterns that suggest something that might be useful. And across different cross-sections, what I'm starting to notice in the survey data on African Americans is that a lot of Trump opinions are becoming racial disparity opinions, right? Now, they're doing polls now showing Biden doing better than Trump, and I'm not sure if they're disaggregating that stuff out, but if we looked at some of the polling data I have, like 3/4 of the respondents are leaning towards Biden. And of course, these are African-American respondents, and a lot of them are Democrats, right? So this isn't something that should be odd. And someone during another press call asked me about those findings, and I had to admit to him that right now, I don't feel like Biden's got black votes in the bag. A lot of people are talking like that, but I don't really see that to be the case. We usually notice these patterns where as the general election goes on, there either is or isn't a consolidation of African American voters towards the Democratic candidate. And if you're in the 70 something percent range, it's clear that consolidation hasn't happened for Biden. Now, whether or not Biden uses the racial disparities messaging as a way to hit President Trump during the campaign in an attempt to move African American voters more over to his side is yet to be seen, right? We don't know what's going to happen yet. But I know for a fact, looking at the polling data that I'm currently seeing, that Biden's got some work to do. Not that he's not enjoying a large lead among Black people, but he would need an upwards of the mid 80% range lead among Black people in order to secure the election. And so, like, you're not asking me about who's going to win, but you are asking about the presidential election. I figured I could tell you that. And gubernatorial elections too. So one of the things we notice too with Black voters is that they're not very happy if they're in states where governors are really pushing to reopen quickly, because a lot of that is going to require people that work in jobs that don't have a lot of autonomy over their hours and over their conditions to get back to work and possibly get sick, and then either not be able to earn a wage because they spend a significant amount of time away from their jobs or lose their lives, right? And so in the survey I did with the African American Research Collaborative, respondents were really quick and ready to tell us through their responses to survey questions that they are very much concerned that the, I guess, aggressive approach to reopening businesses is being done in a way that's tone deaf to the disproportionate impact that reopening businesses abruptly will have on communities of color. And some respondents are actually saying it's stronger than that. They're saying that perhaps the aggression that's being shown with respect to reopening the economy in some of these southern states, for example, is actually a reflection of the fact that it would doing so would have a disproportionately negative impact medically on African Americans. And so, at least in those two cases, looking at state level leaders like governors and looking at the upcoming general election, this is what the polling that I'm doing with African American communities would suggest.
Great. Well, certainly, again, I feel like I've said the same thing after every response, right? But more things to keep an eye on as we head toward November. And I think that's kind of the point of polls, right? You could do them often, see how things change, measure over time, and on down the line from there. Well, we are just about at time here. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. And thank you, Ray, for your time today and for that excellent presentation. We hope that all of you will join us on Tuesday at 3 p.m. for the next Pandemic 101 lecture, which is titled After the End of the World, and will be presented by Michael Berube, the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Literature in the College of the Liberal Arts. And again, for the members of the class of 2024 who are with us, you can visit the prospective student page on the Liberal Arts website to schedule a remote appointment with our recruitment coordinator, Chantel Harley. So thank you all again for joining us today. I'm Jenna Spinelli, and enjoy the rest of your day.